Miranda Devine, it's so good to have you again on the Will Cain podcast. I'd love to start, well, diving right into the deep end. Is Facebook spying on me? Is Facebook spying on you? Is Facebook spying on all of us?
I think we have to say yes, it is. And if you are engaging in what they regard as wrongthink, and that could mean questioning the 2020 election, or it just could mean that you have conservative views, you will be spied upon. And the chances are, as Facebook has done to other people, your private messaging with other friends could be sent to the FBI without a search warrant, without probable cause, and the FBI's domestic violence extremism unit in their Washington field office will take an interest in you, and from what we've been told by a whistleblower, they will then farm out these notifications from Facebook to various other field offices, which will then raise a proper subpoena, and so that they can officially and legally have a look at your messages. But they know exactly what to look for because Facebook's already shown it to them.
And that's the news that we need to talk about today. It'll come as no surprise to most people watching and listening that Facebook is spying on them. What will come as a surprise, what is the breaking news, is that Facebook is spying on them and then turning over their private messages, not just their posts, but their private messages to the FBI. Now, in your reporting, which you've written about this at the New York Post, what do sources tell you, Miranda, will get you flagged by Facebook? You brought up questioning the 2020 election. What will get me turned over to the FBI?
Any message that is questioning authority, that is critical of the government, those are the sorts of messages that are seen as subversive by Facebook, that are obviously out of the millions of messages that go on every day in this country on Facebook. Those are the ones that their bots, that their algorithms are red flagging as being worthy of FBI interest. And so Facebook is acting as an arm of the federal government, as an arm of law enforcement. This is the kind of chilling, Stasi-like future that we never thought would happen in America, because America, of all countries in the world, is protected by its brilliant constitution. But what is happening here is basically a subversion or a bypassing of the constitution.
Yeah, and I want to follow up and dive deeper into that. This acting as an arm of the federal government, circumventing the Constitution, and turning at least our digital lives into living in East Germany.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Stasi. There was a famous movie called The Lives of Others, which was amazing, about how neighbors were employed by the East German secret police to spy upon one another. And that's what's happening to our digital lives. But I want to start, although I agree with you in your characterization, I want to start playing devil's advocate. Would Facebook not say that they are simply passing along leads the way any private citizen might pass along leads if they saw something suspicious? So, for example, for the past 2 decades, Americans have been encouraged to see something, say something. If you see something on the subway that you find suspicious, tell the authorities. If I'm sitting around in my neighborhood and I see something that resembles the potential for terrorism, I'm encouraged to call the FBI field office. Could Facebook not say, we're simply taking leads and turning them over to the FBI?
Look, that is certainly what Mark Zuckerberg's defense of himself is. What he's saying is that the FBI is coming to them like they did, for instance, just before the New York Post ran our Hunter Biden story before the 2020 election. And the FBI went to Facebook and warned them in quite detailed specifics about an upcoming piece of Russian disinformation that they should look out for. And I asked Facebook what exactly it was that the FBI warned them about. I said, did they mention Hunter Biden? Did they mention Joe Biden? Did they mention Ukraine or a laptop? And the answer came back, which I thought was interesting because of the omissions, the answer came back saying, no, they didn't mention Hunter Biden. So I'm assuming from that they at least mentioned Joe Biden. So there was enough specifics that Facebook is saying, well, the FBI, Zuckerberg said this on the Joe Rogan podcast, the FBI I regard as a legitimate law enforcement organization, and when they come to us and they ask us to watch out for something that they say is dangerous, we have to abide by that. So that's Facebook's side of it. I guess my pushback on that is that this is an unaccountable globalist oligopoly that does not have America's national interests in mind, that does not respect the First Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the Constitution. But really, where I have more insight, because I don't have a Facebook whistleblower, but I have spoken to a number of FBI whistleblowers, and what they're saying is that the kind of scrutiny that's being placed on sort of what you'd call conservatives or MAGA Republicans is far outweighs any scrutiny that was ever put on, say, Antifa. There is a real drive from the FBI to pin first of all, to say that domestic violence, extremism is the greatest threat hitting America, which reflects the Democrats and particularly Joe Biden's rhetoric. And secondly, that really the bulk of that, the most dangerous part of that domestic violence comes from, conservatives or Trump Republicans or, what Joe Biden calls semi-fascist, what Hillary Clinton called deplorables, etc. So this is just what appears, at least from what the whistleblowers are telling us and what we see from the outside, that the FBI has been fully weaponized to attack one side of politics.
Yes, I think you have just wonderfully laid out the two answers to my devil's advocacy. And that is, it's not simply the equivalent of private citizens turning over suspicious leads to law enforcement, but it is A, law enforcement deputizing private citizens to do things that law enforcement could not because it's bound by the Constitution.
Exactly.
And B, they are applying those standards not universally, but through partisan politics. And so let's work ourselves backwards. Let's start with B, where you say you have a whistleblower and direct reporting experience. So what we know right now, first let's stick with Facebook and then we'll move to the federal government, is it doesn't appear this was applied universally. These leads, these messages turned over to the FBI didn't include, for example, Antifa. I don't know, by the way. I don't know that you know. Do they include Islamist terrorist potentiality? But we do know they include their mark of domestic terrorism, which is right-wing politics.
Yes, and particularly when it comes to the January 6th riot, which, curiously, extraordinarily, the FBI has devoted so many resources that they call this proudly the biggest investigation the FBI has ever undertaken in its history. Over, a 3-hour riot in which the only person who was killed was a Trump supporter shot by a cop. They seemed, it's like the FBI has drunk the same Kool-Aid that the January 6th committee, that Joe Biden, that Democrats have, that this is somehow the worst terrorist attack on the United States ever, worse than the 9/11. That is just so insulting to the victims of 9/11. It's so dangerous because it's taking our eye off the ball. But what it does tell you is that where, the Patriot Act was a sort of violation of civil liberties employed in a way that I guess a lot of Americans were happy with because they felt that it was going to keep us safe from Islamist terrorism. That Patriot Act has now been turned back on American citizens who are, conservative voters.
Yeah, and there were those that warned at the time, by the way, of the expansive nature of the Patriot Act and that it could be weaponized against the American people. And we seem to be seeing that right now, that the Patriot Act is allowing our domestic law enforcement to not just spy, but to non-universally apply the law. to American citizens.
Yeah.
Now, so Miranda, the House Judiciary GOP has subpoenaed or made a request to the FBI about some of which you've alluded to right here, and that's the political nature of the FBI's investigation to January 6th in a way that doesn't limit it to January 6th. So in other words, you mentioned this and you started to go down this path. The contention of not just the Biden administration, but of the FBI and the CIA is that the greatest threat to America right now is domestic terrorism, not Islamist terrorism, but domestic terrorism. And January 6th is being used as a way to, in essence, juke the stats of domestic terrorism. You said this a moment ago, by farming out the suspects of January 6th from the Washington field office to the various field offices around the country, Dallas, Houston, St. Louis, Los Angeles, therefore making it appear as though domestic terrorism is being seeded all across the country, when in fact all of this is attributable to, in the House GOP letter, they say, one black swan event in January 6th.
Exactly. And, you can describe, for instance, the way that, say on 9/11, there was a big spike. A lot of cops were killed that day. So there was a big spike in cop killing. You therefore did not use that as a sort of a pretext to say, attacks on police are soaring, because that was a black swan event. That was a one-off day. Similarly, they've had a lot of arrests and they're prosecuting a lot of people over what happened on January 6th, but that does not mean that there's an overall rise in domestic terrorism. But by farming these cases out and sort of bypassing the usual sort of numbering system and case management that the FBI uses on their systems, they can then create an impression that this is some nationwide ballooning of domestic violence extremism. The other thing they're doing is sort of redefining what domestic violence is. For instance, the Betsy Ross flag, the Gadsden flag, the Don't Tread on Me flag, even mentioning Ashley Babbitt, who was shot dead on January 6th by a Capitol Police officer. All of those things are now seen as, they're in the FBI handbook, we know that because Project Veritas got a leaked version of it, as signs of domestic terrorism. And at the same time, what they've done, which is really evil, and I'll be writing about more in this week in my column, is that they're redefining sort of restricted areas outside the Capitol, which were not restricted areas on January 6th, but they have since redefined them sort of post facto so that anybody who wandered into them didn't go into the Capitol, didn't engage in any violence, did absolutely nothing wrong, is now caught up in some sort of, post facto law breaking.
So let me see if I understand what you're telling me is about to come soon in new reporting from the New York Post, that they are sort of redistricting area around the Capitol to off limits pedestrian traffic and applying that ex post facto, applying that to history, specifically the history of January 6th. So what might have not been off limits in 2021, today is now off limits. And now they're saying, look, the speed limit is, 55 now. It wasn't then. And you were going 65, but it's 55 now, and we're going to apply it to you back then. And therefore, and I don't mean to jump through a few steps here, therefore, you're a domestic terrorist for trespassing into restricted areas on the Capitol?
Exactly. And, even if that doesn't stand up in court, it works in their statistics. And look, another example is, I'm told that there's a, the Portland office of the FBI, of the DOJ attached to the FBI, is full of left-wingers. And I'm sure that applies across the country, that the lawyers in the DOJ tend to be more left-wing traditionally than, FBI agents who are sort of Second Amendment guys and girls. So say you have the Portland office, you have... I'm told that one analyst there has come up with some statistic saying that, domestic violence extremism is just like off the charts. And that then got transmitted to Christopher Wray, who then uttered those words in Senate testimony. And then it goes from there to the White House with no real fact-checking in between. It's just that suits the narrative that the White House wants, suits the narrative that Christopher Wray wants because he's a willing lapdog to Joe Biden and the Biden administration. And so somehow then we have the media lapping it up because now they have evidence. And we have this sort of moral panic going on about domestic violence, which, I mean, it's bad enough that it sort of demonizes Trump voters or, MAGA Republicans basically. But also, what other crimes are potentially happening? What other dangers are there to Americans that the FBI is not looking at? Another, potential 9/11, all these terrorist suspects that are coming across the southern border, and many that we don't even know have come across. The FBI is so singularly fixated on January 6th that it must be missing other dangers in the country. And we are paying $10 billion a year for this agency. And, we are now just praying that nothing terrible happens while they're not looking.
Well, what a wonderful and ominous point you make. I mean, look, resources and attention are not infinite. At some point, whatever you're giving attention to means you are neglecting to give attention to something else. And if the FBI is prioritizing, I think that's clear, prioritizing domestic terrorism, they're taking attention away from something else. The House GOP letter, which just came out in the last day or so, says specifically that a whistleblower with inside the FBI is saying, well, we're being told to deprioritize child sexual crime. We're now paying less attention to child sexual crime. But you bring up another one, which I can't imagine is getting full attention, which is the potential for terrorism making its way through our southern border.
Yes, we know, I think it's something like a dozen suspected terrorists who are on the terror watch list have come across the border in, recent months. And then, there are 500,000 gotaways. You'd imagine that people who are suspected terrorists would not give themselves up to authorities. So God knows what's going on in the country, and these people will have melted away into the shadows. And I just think it's frightening to think that the FBI is just zooming in on this one day, this one riot that doesn't appear with all the reporting, all the facts we've seen. There doesn't seem to have been, part of some greater terrorist plot. Certainly looking at the charges, the prosecutions, it doesn't seem to be. They're looking for something that doesn't seem to exist. And, it's frightening because, as you say, one of these whistleblowers I've spoken to has said that, he was on child protection. That was his specialty. But because they're short-staffed in Washington, because they've got so many people they're trying to round up, innocent people, many of them, that he was taken off child protection. And so, those crimes continue with no one looking at them. And meanwhile, I've interviewed innocent people who didn't even go into the Capitol that day. One guy in New York, an elderly gentleman, he was in a hotel. He went to the Trump rally with some friends. They went back to the hotel, had a drink, having some peanuts and bar food while the riot was happening, wandered on up later on, not knowing what had happened. He got raided by the FBI months later in New York. They broke down the door of not only his home, his apartment, but his elderly mother's apartment where he was staying, and they seized all his devices. And they ended up giving them back to him a year later, no charges. Just the process is the punishment. They did the same thing to Rudy Giuliani, and they were spying on Rudy Giuliani for 2 years. So I just think it looks as if the FBI is completely out of control. It's abusing its powers. And I think it's very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle.
Well, the process is the punishment. What a sad but profound statement. So when I played devil's advocacy, you gave me two reasons why this is simply not akin to private citizens passing on leads to law enforcement. One was the political nature of the application of these leads being pursued by the FBI and Facebook. But two was the collusion between law enforcement and Facebook that allows our federal government to circumvent the United States Constitution, deputizing Facebook and social media companies to spy on American citizens. It becomes a self-licking ice cream cone. So you turn over these messages to the FBI, helping them to then field out the stats on domestic terrorism, giving them greater power to make the case to the public that domestic terrorism is our greatest threat, thus giving up infinitely more privacy. So let's talk about that, whether or not the federal government can deputize Facebook, whether or not they have deputized Facebook. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri had a fascinating exchange with a Facebook executive about this. This was largely centered around COVID and quote-unquote misinformation. But that Facebook executive, Miranda, which I'm sure you've seen the testimony, was pretty open. Yeah. This is our policy. And Josh Hawley said, well, if you have standards and practices that are consistently applied and you're coordinating with the federal government, both before and after, you are an agent of the government. You are no longer a private enterprise simply abiding by your terms of service.
Exactly. And that was a fascinating exchange. And Josh Hawley did a great job of just very sedately teasing out exactly what Facebook is doing. And Facebook, that executive just didn't seem to be ashamed or understand that what he was doing was wrong. And, because he said, well, COVID was an emergency and we were saving lives here. And everything's an emergency, if it's not COVID, it's, climate change, or if it's not climate change, it's domestic terrorism. You define, it's all about who defines what the emergency is and this existential crisis. And it seems like, there's a new existential crisis in the Biden administration every day to take the attention off their malfeasance and incompetence. But I think there's another interesting part of this Facebook sort of bypassing the First Amendment, being an agent of the federal government. And that comes in a lawsuit that Alex Berenson, a former New York Times reporter, has won basically against Twitter. He got reinstated, but he's now suing Twitter for basically breaching his First Amendment rights because they acted as an agent of the government. And once they do that, they're liable for, breaching his rights. So it's a complicated lawsuit, but he's quite confident that he'll get somewhere. And already he's managed to force Facebook to allow him back onto the platform after they cancelled him because in his discovery, he managed to get a whole lot of private communications on the, this wasn't Facebook, this was Twitter, but same thing, right. Social media, on the Twitter Slack channel, in which they specifically targeted Alex Berenson by name to be deplatformed and censored on the say-so of the White House. The White House was complaining about Alex Berenson. Joe Biden was getting up on his podium and railing against social media for endangering American lives. And so there's a clear line between the White House, social media companies, and their censorship. And we saw the same thing in lots of other instances. We've seen where the White House, for instance, when they sicked the FBI onto mums and dads at school, school board meetings, we saw it with the censorship of the New York Post.
Yeah, by the way, you bringing up Berenson's lawsuit, emails have revealed, discovery has revealed exactly what you just said. The Biden administration made a direct request to social media companies to take down this particular individual, meaning Berenson. We know through lawsuits, I believe from the attorneys general of both Missouri and Louisiana, that Facebook and other social media companies here's how they were acting as agents of the federal government. The Biden administration would make requests. Hey, can you take this down? And within 46 seconds, they got a reply from, I believe in this case, it was Facebook. Yep, we're on it. And there was consistent communication to suggest this was collusion between the federal government and these social media companies. And, it'll be interesting, Miranda, how this, what will be the end of this story when it comes to the American Constitution? Because there is a case out of Texas, and so therefore it's gone to the Fifth Circuit, where it is said that a Texas law prohibiting big tech companies from censoring private citizens is perfectly constitutional. So we can limit the ability, democratically, we can limit the ability of social media companies to censor us. The 11th Circuit out of Florida said, no, that's a private company and they have their own First Amendment rights. You can't tell them they can't censor. Meaning, if the 5th and the 11th Circuit are in conflict, this goes to the Supreme Court of the United States, who will soon be ruling on exactly whether or not these institutions are private companies.
Yeah, whether they're private companies that can do what they like, or whether they actually are the new public square and they have control over the pipelines of information that most of us use. I think it would be very dangerous to allow, unaccountable globalist oligopolies control over the public square in America. I think, that's the end of free speech.
Yeah, and you brought this up, by the way, and I wrote this down because I wanted to, and I'm sure I've failed to make it exhaustive, but you point out like the rolling state of emergencies. In some states, I know, for example, in the state of New York, they declared racism as a state of emergency. I think there's been some encouragement by like national civil rights leader at the National Urban League to say, the threat to democracy is a state of emergency. So under this, whatever the state of emergency might be, it allows for, of course, setting aside all manner of due process and rights. And it's not been limited to COVID. It's included, of course, vaccine efficacy, the COVID origins, the lab leak theory, all of this censored on social media. The 2020 presidential election, January 6th, Russiagate. You'll remember Ukraine. You couldn't really ask questions about the war between Ukraine and Russia. I don't know if you still can or not, but there for a time, you certainly were not required to fly the Ukrainian flag, but certainly not ask questions about the legitimacy of the Ukrainian side of the war.
Exactly. Lockdowns.
Andrew Tate. I don't even know what Andrew Tate's done, but I know that the entire social media apparatus, the only other story, Miranda, that I can think of where the entire apparatus marched in lockstep would be two. It'd be the censorship of your Hunter Biden story, which everyone shut down at the same time unanimously, and kicking Donald Trump off of the internet. Yeah. And now Andrew Tate. Those three are where you go, these aren't independent decisions being made coincidentally at the same time.
No, it's collusion. And the only thing is that it's all done behind closed doors. So we get little glimpses from these little court cases. And I think these court cases are crucial. Alex Berenson, it's a real David versus Goliath battle there. But he's determined, and, he's a very sharp journalist, forensic mind, and very dogged. And so he is just going to hammer it until he finds the answer and gets the evidence that he knows is there. We all know that collusion is going on because we can see the fruits of it. It's just we need the evidence. I know that, Facebook and Twitter are colluded with the Democrats and the FBI and John Brennan and those 51 former intelligence officials to shut down our story. And the more that comes out, the more evidence there is, the more damning it looks. For instance, I mentioned that Rudy Giuliani, from a few weeks after he took over as Donald Trump, the then sitting president's personal attorney. A covert surveillance warrant was issued to basically to allow the FBI to spy on his cloud, all his emails, all his text messages. And so in August of 2020, when the laptop repair shop guy sent him that first email, the whistleblower from Delaware, to say, look, I've got Hunter Biden's laptop. It has a whole lot of damning information about it, about Ukraine. Then, of course, we had Rudy Giuliani conversing with this guy, and then the FBI had access to that. They also had access to my text messages with Rudy Giuliani, in which they basically could have figured out when that they knew that New York Post then was interested, and they could figure out when we were roughly going to be publishing. So that means that they were forewarned before our story came out, and that's why when they went to Facebook, they could give Mark Zuckerberg and his people a lot of specifics, so that it took them, almost instantaneously, they knew what they were looking for. And no doubt they went to Twitter, and for all we know, they could have gone to the New York Times and Washington Post, all these institutions that acted in concert to shut us down. And then you take the letter from the 51 former intelligence officials like John Brennan, James Clapper, Leon Panetta. Now, that letter came out within 4 days of our story. It's pretty hard to get 51 people coordinated to write a pretty controversial letter alleging dishonestly that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, or bore all the hallmarks. And that letter came just in time for Joe Biden to take it up on stage when he had that final debate with Donald Trump, when he knew this story was going to be used against him. And he used the letter to exonerate himself. It got him off the hook. And the rest was history, because that was the fig leaf that social media and the rest of the media needed to not treat the story seriously.
If you can't see the collusion in the timeline that you just laid out for us, I think you have willful blinders on. Yeah. I should have, by the way, in my non-exhaustive list of examples of topics that are now off limits, also included PayPal and GoFundMe restricting funds being dedicated to the Canadian truckers convoy. Yeah. Of course, at the behest of the Canadian government and Justin Trudeau. And that leads us back to this entire premise and this entire conversation, Miranda. We might be focused too narrowly on Facebook, on Twitter, on social media, because what we are looking at is an unholy alliance of collusion that seems to involve at least these four players. The United States government, as exhibited by law enforcement agencies like Facebook, big tech companies, pretty much all of them across the board, the vast majority of mainstream corporate media who work as the launderers of this misinformation censorship campaign, in that they provide the fact check. Facebook says it outsources legitimacy of information to quote unquote fact checkers. That means the PolitiFacts of the world are complicit in this censorship regime. And it has to be said, the Democratic Party, because it doesn't seem to work in concert only against the Republican Party. And I don't say that from a partisan perspective. I say that looking at this, as you've just laid it out, those four actors seem to be working in collusion with one another to censor Americans.
Absolutely, and censor Americans for one side of the political argument. So, and I think this has come about as the Democratic Party has become the party of Wall Street, of Silicon Valley, of the mega wealthy, whereas the Republican Party has become now the party of the middle class. And of course, then the very poor and the welfare dependent, of course, are beholden to the Democratic Party, which use them as their shock troops, use them as their cannon fodder, they ballot harvest from them and so on. And then they keep them on the teat, unable to move up in the world. They keep them on drugs. They keep them, on welfare and having a sort of a twilight life. And so that's why you're seeing not only this sort of corporate collusion with the Democratic Party, but you're also seeing, when it comes to elections, the Republicans being outspent 10-1 by Democrats.
Showing you that the fifth character in this melodrama that I just laid out would be big corporations and Wall Street.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's why, there was a sort of a speech given just after the election by a Chinese professor, and just after the 2020 election. And he had a big auditorium of students, and he was crowing and boasting about the fact that basically Joe Biden had won, and that was with the help of the Chinese, and that the Chinese Communist Party had always had their friends in Wall Street. And unfortunately, when Donald Trump came along, the quote that he gave was, "Wall Street could not fix Trump." The Chinese were perplexed that their usual methods of manipulating American policy to suit them weren't working under Donald Trump. And so this guy also made a comment about Hunter Biden and his great riches, and made a joke about, how do you think he got all of that? So that tells you that Wall Street is not acting in America's national interest. It's acting like big tech in the interests of some globalist agenda.
So let's end our conversation with this. What can be done? What can be done to fight back against this regime of censorship? And I think the best way, and I don't know if it's the best way, but it's the way I want to ask you this, is what will be done about the story where you have been at the center? What will be done about Hunter Biden? Because if there can be nothing done about bringing not just truth but accountability to the story of Hunter Biden, how can we ever have hope that there will ever be any type of accountability for this collusion of 5 parties censoring Americans?
Well, look, I guess our hopes are resting on the Republican Party. The voters will do their part and, vote out the Democrats, at least in the House, possibly in the Senate at the midterms. And that gives the Republican Party an enormous opportunity to turn back the tide on all these disasters, including the border crisis, and the censorship regime and the weaponizing of the DOJ and the FBI. They don't have to wait until 2024. However, when it comes to corruption in Washington, I think it's a bipartisan problem and has been for a long time. Influence peddling is not just a Democrat disease. And Joe Biden is the past master of it, and we have a blueprint to how it works thanks to Hunter Biden. But the Republicans have to really have their heart in it. They cannot try and go soft on Democrats for fear that they themselves will be unmasked. And so I think that for Americans, we really need to watch the Republicans and hold them to account. If they get the power, if the people give them power and give them the majority, they need to use it and not squander it, as we saw them do in the past when they let Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's administration off the hook for all their atrocities.
So let me finish with this question. What do you mean by use that power? For me, I hope that means force some accountability on whether or not the president of the United States is actually compromised through his son and the truth of the Hunter Biden story. 1. 2, pass legislation that treats these big tech companies the way they have behaved, not as private enterprise, but as some form of apparatus of the Democratic Party. But what I am concerned about, I will tell you, because I think also corruption and power is not monopolized by the Democratic Party. Maybe best exhibited, but not monopolized. And I think an appropriate fear would be instead of reforming or rehabbing this system, the Republican Party decides they can use that power as well. Like, why don't they weaponize the DOJ? Why don't they exert their influence over big tech? Why don't they censor their political opponents? That's the risk in walking down this path. It's not simply turning us into East Germany, but it turns us into in our situation in America, every 4 years, new regimes of many tyrannies wielding the power of the government on various factions within America.
Yeah, that I've thought about that. I mean, that really is, we just descend into Rwanda. It's
yes,
not a path any of us want to go down. Look, there are things that they can do. They can break up big tech aggressively. They need to aggressively either shut down the FBI. I mean, look, former FBI agents who loved the badge and loved what they did and revered the institution think that it's too far gone. Trump, I think, made a big mistake by allowing Obama holdovers in there. I think that there is so much corruption and bias in the institutions in Washington that they really need to be viciously and aggressively cut off at the knees. So, I hope that the Republican Party, if it gets that opportunity, does not go weak and does not go down that Paul Ryan path that they did, does not get again hoodwinked by another Russia collusion hoax, whoever is the president. The damage that the Democrats were able to do, because they are so well organized, they are so prone to busting norms while accusing their opponents of doing that. They really do unconscionable things, and we don't want the Republicans to do unconscionable things, but by the same token, they really need to be awake, sharp, strategic, sort of like Ron DeSantis has been in everything that he's done in Florida.
Yeah, that is a great example. I agree. Miranda Devine, always great to hear from you and talk with you about this ominous censorship regime and the way it's played a role in your personal career over the last several years. Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you, Will.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain podcast for full episodes right now.